Good afternoon, Craig. It's lovely to meet you. Thank you for joining me today. Tell me about your research. What is the Children's Climate Risk Index?
You've got risk maps where you're looking at the physical drivers, but also how vulnerable are the people underneath. And UNICEF said, could we work with them to help them develop a child risk index where we would map the hazards that children are exposed to, just as adults are, but we would also look at the particular vulnerability of children. What is it about children that makes them in some way differently vulnerable to adults in that environment? So children, for example, suffer particularly certain illnesses associated with lack of nutrition. Certain diseases impact children in different ways, and they have very little agency themselves. So UNICEF are particularly interested in us getting the data and working with them to combine that into a global risk index. And that's what was produced, and that's what we've worked on for the last, 7 or 8 months with them quite intensely, is to produce these global maps of today, 2020, country rankings, where are the children most at risk. And by that we mean, how much climate impact there'll be, but also where are the children poorest, where are the children's legal issues, where are the legal issues, the less protection, least nutrition, combining that into risk. And then the next element is we will look at where things may be in 2050 under different scenarios of climate change going into the future.
So what do the findings tell us about climate change and the risks to children?
Well, the first thing that is worth saying is that the risk map is different to just the hazard map. So we produce a map that shows you where floods and droughts are, but then we produce a map of vulnerability, which is based around poverty and other variables. When you combine those, they focus in on some very specific areas of the world where children are greatly at risk. And that is really sub-Saharan Africa. You've got a lot of exposure there. You've got a very young population there. So there's a real focus for policymakers on a global scale. And also South Asia, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. So what you do get is this quite clear regions that need focus, which are different to where climate change may be worse, because it may be pretty bad in the USA, but they have the resources to tackle it. But in many countries it's going to be really bad. They really don't have the resources, and particularly children are impacted. So it's making that differential about children specifically that this approach has emphasised.
How are the lives of vulnerable children around the world being threatened? Is it just a case of impacts of their environment, or I know you sort of mentioned that there might be some other factors involved in certain parts of the world?
Yeah, it's quite a complicated environment when we think about children and the risks specifically to children. The starting point with children, and part of this work was a very in-depth review of the literature, and it's very interesting. And the starting point is that children have very little agency. So they could be subject to things like migration. So, people are moving, children may be left behind with only one parent, or they're moving, and they may lose a lot of their social context. And children are very vulnerable to that, particularly vulnerable to a loss of home or a sense of place. So in a way, the psychological stress is that the issues for children can be quite intense. Then, of course, there are the malnutrition issues. Children will disproportionately suffer from malnutrition. They can disproportionately suffer from things like water pollution. Their immune systems are not as well developed. So they can be iller quicker, if you like, in cholera. If you have a cholera outbreak, it's children. And those with immune deficiencies, and those who are not fed well, but children will often be in the front line of that. So because of those things, they're experiencing the same climate change, but their vulnerabilities are very different.
That's really interesting, actually. I guess in order for efficient policy to be put forward, I suppose you have to understand that vulnerability in order, like you say, to shift the resources into the right places, and yeah, so it's really, really important.
So we tend to think of the poor as this sort of homogenous, slightly inert group. They're not, actually. They're a very diverse group who also have a lot of diverse strategies. When I've been into communities, I've always been really impressed by the kind of entrepreneurship, people really struggling but are doing multiple things, are strategizing to survive. And you're absolutely right, policymakers tend to say, well, we will do this for the poor. well, which aspect of the poor are you talking about? The agricultural, migration, those who are fishing in this country, you're talking about the inner city poor. There's a diverse range of poverties and issues that can be associated from gender to race to all sorts of issues. And we need to understand them to be efficient about how we deal with. It's like medicine, you prescribe it when you really understand the illness, as opposed to some vague sense of somebody being ill.
How will the Children's Climate Risk Index be used at COP26?
It's interesting. I mean, I have to say it was very well received. So it went probably more than we thought it would, to be honest with you. Wow. UNICEF were very impressed with it because it went up New York Times, it went to CNN, it went to the BBC. I think it hit at the right time because it made this bold statement that a billion children are exposed to more than one serious hazard in the year, and then a series of facts underneath. And the press sort of picked up on this. What it does is give a national ranking for children at risk, and that always interests people internationally, where are countries occurring. At this level, it was more of like a clarion call. It was a thing, and that's what Greta used it for. She's using it to make the point that these are people without agency, these are people who are the next generation, and we have to speak for them because they don't have that voice. I mean, she's doing a great job of doing a voice for young people. Absolutely. But this is the data. And I've always agreed with her point. She said, you don't listen to me, you listen to the science. That's what we all need to be listening to. Yeah. And this is the science. It's the best we can do with the data we have to show that there are huge areas where children are at extreme risk of climate change, and therefore we need those policies. So we see this as a beginning of a process, and this is a call to arms, whereas we do want to do a lot more work. We will do 2050 on Earth Day in April, but the aim of it then is to do a much more detailed subnational, to help those policymakers start mapping at a very high resolution so that they can begin to tune their policies. But COP is about pressure. It is about pressure at the moment. Definitely. It's about doing all we can to say you can't leave those rooms and bluff. You need this, take account of these people.
And like you say, I think it came at a really good time, and people, I think even ever more now than ever, there's a big push for youth engagement, youth involvement, and
absolutely.
It's amazing to see. It's brilliant to hear so many youth now standing up, and
I think it's fantastic because that gives a sense of longevity, and because it's really hard for a politician to push back in the face of children. So it's bringing in that factor of saying it's not just about it's these people you have a responsibility to, and are you going to let these people down when
Yeah, absolutely. And I think
people feel that
exactly.
So,
and then having the index as a sort of more factual basis
yes.
to then see
exactly
these people need your help, and here's
the maps.
Yeah,
you need that.
The information
that.
for you. So it's sort of backing up what people have been saying. So I think
otherwise it's just sort of warm words, and politicians are very good at getting around those or agreeing. But when you say, here's $1 billion, what are you going to be doing about how do we reduce that number? When we do this in 20 years' time, will it be bigger or less? You begin to put a marker down.
Yeah.
And that allows you to assess progress and think about global policy. So it's important to do both sides of that.
Yeah.
I think very important.
Yeah, no, definitely. I agree. I think that's one thing that's become a lot more apparent to me actually as well during my studies, is that it's not just quite often the topic of, I don't know, for example, in the marine world, the climate change on the ocean is discussed in a completely different context than providing food for coastal communities.
Yes,
in a
which of course it's a major
aspect.
feature of.
Yeah, for sure. And I think
blue economy.
Actually, these things are holistic, and that you need to understand the whole system in order to make that change. And that's one thing actually that the sort of combination of the social change with the working with the physical changes is becoming more and more important, and I think that's really started to stand out for me as something that's
which is great. And what I like about that is when you talk to people who come from a physical background, maybe hydrological modelling, they want their models to mean something. You can just get involved in the physics, and you do need people doing that. You do need people absolutely need that blue skies research. But there's also quite a lot of people who will then be saying, I'm really interested, but it would be nice to know that this has an impact. And I find particularly actually towards the end of people's careers, people come up and say, look, I've done 20 years, 30 years of modelling. I'd really like to know that this has some bearing on people's lives. So I think that more and more people may be studying a core subject, but they want to know how it connects with the environment, green economies, growth, these issues, because the real world is made up of these things.
Yeah.
We have imposed these boundaries,
exactly.
usually because of the tools we use, i.e. mathematical, i.e. this, has divided us up. But actually, the world doesn't care about our boundaries. It runs, that is one system.
It does.
So the more we can have systems thinkers and integrated systems thinkers, the better, I think.
Absolutely. And I think quite often you find as well, once you start working on one issue in a particular field, you actually sort of find yourself.
Yes.
Also, it sort of snowballs a bit, and then you find yourself
and connections and networks
you're connecting
and other
with
interests.
Other things, and suddenly you're
absolutely
having these other discussions, and it all leads in. So yeah, it's really
and there's a lot more funding now for this. So where in the past, if you wanted to do that kind of thing, you did it when you retired. But now there's a lot more funding that says you will work with a multidisciplinary team producing a transdisciplinary output. So you need to do that. So in fact, funders and governments and people have learned that they want their results to be more policy relevant.
Yeah.
And to be policy relevant, it needs to be broader, usually. So there's this sort of pragmatic requirement in funding that is driving what is a very effective connectivity in academia to also, UN agencies, NGOs, private sector. So we are doing that. Southampton does that particularly well, I have to say. There are a few universities that do it well. Southampton's certainly up there in being very good at doing this integrated type approach.
Yeah.
And linking with different agencies and private sectors. But it is a particularly good university for that.
Yeah, it's great actually to be like in that environment where it is so forward thinking, and it is so on the cutting edge of a lot of things. So,
absolutely. It is very good in that line.
It is, no, exactly. What do you hope will be accomplished at COP26 this year?
I hope what everyone is probably hoping is no different, in that if there isn't a clear plan of action, then there is nothing. And then that's got to be followed in a dogged way. At the minute, there's an awful lot of money being promised every year to help out, but we don't even know how to spend that money. There's no structures for that. So there has to be much more institutional structures, capacity to utilise the money effectively, a lot better governance of that of the whole approach. It's got to be the beginning of a process. I mean, perhaps Paris is the beginning of a process. Glasgow will be when we actually define what we meant by that in a detailed plan. What does it mean for policy? What does it mean for Kenya? What does it mean for San Salvador? What does it mean for these different parts of the world? And how are we going to implement it in detail? And that's a lot.
Definitely.
It's asking a lot, but we need that now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think with those solid plans and actionable outcomes and those numbers sort of comes the accountability. If it's all words,
then we can
there's
measure
no way of holding anybody or anything accountable, because there's no benchmark.
Absolutely.
So I completely agree. I think that drive for
Yeah, I think, and let's see, the outcomes will take time. It could be over a year that we'll see it. But I suspect if it's not strong enough, there will be a big backlash, and there will be all sorts of issues associated with it. And my guess is that it will be okay, but not quite there, and then we'll need to keep pushing. I think we'll never stop needing to push in this area. All I hope is that there's enough coming out of COP, enough real commitment, that we've got something to get our teeth into and move. Because if we don't, really, we keep saying this is the last year, but we really are getting...
Yeah.
I mean, the truth is it's already happening, and it's happening worse than we thought. So even when we do that, well, we will find ourselves with big impacts. They're already happening. I've seen them, many people have seen them. So it's going to take a long time to just stop what's already happened, let alone future. It's a complete transition, economic transition that we need. We've just got to find the right leadership in that.
Yeah,
that's going to be
absolutely.
difficult.
I think a big push is needed. Well, thank you very much for speaking to me today. It's been incredibly enlightening, and best of luck with the rest of your endeavours with your risks indexes and everything.
Thank you very much. Very kind. Very nice to talk to you.
Yeah, it's been absolutely lovely.